Hello, I'm really excited to have you back here with me for the show this week. And I'm going to talk about a question that I have seen come up a lot recently in the cultural intelligence workshops that I have been doing. And that question is, who should adapt? It's a big question because when I've seen it in the context of leaders moving from one part of an organization to another, from one country to another to do their job, even from leaders who have moved from one organization to a completely different one, or when a team is coming together, as I was working with earlier this year, and they needed to bring themselves together to collaborate more effectively so they could grow their business. But this question keeps coming up. Whose responsibility is it ultimately to adapt? And to what norms are we creating in the team? And I think this question is really important. It's not theoretical, it's deeply practical because when it goes right, when we understand who should be adapting and how they should be adapting, which is really the work of cultural intelligence, then that leads to better communication, better collaboration, better connection, and ultimately people can do their best work. When it doesn't work, it can have really hard impacts on the work. When I've seen it in teams where teams are struggling with this, it slows things down. Teams don't work well together. They find it difficult to navigate the disagreements or even conflict. And this ultimately creates friction that you don't need or want in your team, let alone in the organization, and ultimately can stop even projects happening altogether. So this matters. And it matters because, as well, particularly in this moment in time, because I've seen it in the teams and organizations I'm working with. The complexity is getting ever more detailed. The needs and requirements of being able to collaborate really effectively across cultures, whether that is in one location or multiple locations around the world, is again very much increasing. People are joining new environments, whether it's the new team, the new country, and there are different expectations of what professional behaviors and communication styles look like. And that can include things such as different points of view on what time and being on time means, what respect looks like, how to communicate directly, how to give feedback. And some of these things may sound very basic, but if they are not resolved, they can lead to the challenges I was alluding to earlier. And what I see is that there are some assumptions that go into the question that I hear and I shared with you right at the beginning of today's episode. Who should adapt? Well, the first assumption is it's down to the new person or the new group of people, or perhaps the group or individual in the minority. So sometimes there is this unspoken assumption that it's down to them, that they need to, because they are the outsider, because they are outside the majority, they need to adapt to the majority who are there, who are already established, who are doing things the way they've always done them. Now, the problem with that, as you can well imagine, is sometimes this creates resentment. It creates a real sense of, particularly for those people who are in the outside group, in the minority, a sense of frustration around maybe they are very good at what they do, but they can't bring their full selves or their best work to the team. They're not being acknowledged for that. And that can feel out of sync. It can feel unauthentic as well. So that's the first assumption. The second assumption I sometimes hear is, well, everybody should adapt. But that also creates a problem. The problem with this is that if everybody adapts, what are they adapting to? It means that can create confusion and lack of clarity, particularly if people are doing things in a different way from how they've normally done it. And that causes surprise or even frustration with others. So that second assumption also doesn't always work. The third assumption that I sometimes hear is, well, it's not about adaptation at all. Everybody should just be themselves, and then it will be okay. Now, that has a very compelling argument to it. And maybe you have heard people talk about authenticity. Just be authentic, just be yourself. And then that will be the best way for you to be part of the team, to contribute, and for people to recognize what you bring. Now, there's nothing wrong with authenticity, but there is a balance here. If everybody is how they are, that is where, and without the understanding and the empathy of where others are coming from, using cultural intelligence to recognize the differences, this can lead to deep silos where people get into a bit of them and us thinking and feeling, where they feel like they identify with people who are similar to them, but find it very difficult to work with people who are different to them. So these three assumptions, the new person or the new group or the minority should adapt, doesn't work. The assumption that everybody should adapt equally doesn't work. And the third assumption, everybody should just be themselves, should be authentic, also doesn't work. So I'm sure at this point you're asking yourself, well, what does work? What is the right way to move forward? The shift that I want to share with you here today is to change the question that's getting asked. So if you are in a global team or in a very diverse cultural context, maybe you are the person who's new or in the minority, or perhaps you're the person in the majority established, but you're feeling the frustrations and you're asking yourself, but who should adapt? I want you to change the question. The question I want you to be asking instead is, how do we work smarter? Because ultimately, smart work leads to collaboration. Smart work leads to connection. Smart work leads to outcomes, results, because you're able to really understand what is the best path forward. But that doesn't happen by chance. It happens with intention and it happens with action. It helps define things such as how to run meetings, how to communicate certain types of information, how to be direct when it's needed, and how to even disagree with each other. Now, that might sound very obvious things that you perhaps assume right now are happening already in the team. But the reality is, without those explicit conversations, without designing your ways of working, it can lead to the silos I mentioned. It can lead to the frustrations. And ultimately, what sits behind that question, who should adapt, is the sense of not being appreciated for who you are and what you can contribute to the team. So now I'm going to break it down into a framework for you to help you apply this. I'm going to use the Cultural Intelligence framework from the Cultural Intelligence Center, which is very embedded in my work. There are 4 capabilities altogether, and they all start with CQ, which means cultural intelligence. So the first capability is CQ Drive, Cultural Intelligence Drive. And as a team, you have to ask yourselves, why does it matter? Or as a group of leaders, perhaps that's your context. Why does it matter to you? Why does working smarter together really achieve something? This is where, in the examples I gave earlier, when I was working with the leaders, moving into a very new part of their organization in a new country, it mattered because they couldn't be effective as leaders unless they understood how to work smarter. For the organization that I was working with, who were expanding across Europe and had their teams in 2 different locations, for them, they recognized they couldn't collaborate effectively together to be able to do their best work and then grow their client base across Europe unless they were able to understand each other, unless they were able to work smarter together. So ask yourself this now. If you're facing this challenge, what is the CQ drive? Why does it matter to you? That is the starting point. The second part of this is CQ knowledge. Now, CQ knowledge means really being able to diagnose what is going on beneath the surface. How are people being different in their communication style and in their behaviors? Now, in my work, I use 10 behavioral preferences, again defined by the Cultural Intelligence Center, which are very much about non-judgmental language to describe differences in approach. I use it very much in profiles that I use with teams so they can understand where those biggest differences are, which might be causing them the challenges. I go into a bit of detail on this inside my book, Become a Global Leader. If you have that knowledge, you're able then to discuss openly about what is not working today, about why it is that you're having issues with certain types of meetings, or perhaps with certain individuals or certain types of conversations. That knowledge is really important. Being able to diagnose precisely what's going on and where the biggest challenges lie is a very big part of this. But knowing it, being aware of it, it doesn't stop there. You then need to move into your CQ strategy. This is the third part. Now, a CQ strategy is all about coming up with a plan. With the team who were expanding across Europe that I was working with, for them, that was about developing a ways of working charter, being absolutely explicit about how they wanted to run their meetings, how they wanted to have disagreements, what that would look like, what would happen if they had urgent challenges or questions they needed input from others on, and even, how they were going to resolve historic challenges they've had between individuals within the team. For the group of leaders that I was working with, for them, it's about putting together their strategies of how they're going to adapt their leadership, what they're going to do to align more with the expectations of the group. The fourth and final area is CQ action. This is where it really happens because you don't know what's going to work until you try it out. It's great having the plan. It's great having the language to describe the differences, but ultimately, cultural intelligence is an action. So you need to implement something. You need to be able to put your plan in motion and see what works, and to recognize the first time you define those ways of working, you won't get it precisely right the first time. That's why it's a loop. I always recommend that when people get explicit, when they define their ways of working, their way that they want to communicate with each other and behave and interact with each other, that they come back to it on a minimum of a quarterly basis so they can really recognize what's working, what's not, what needs to continue, what needs to stop, and what needs to maybe be introduced. And I think this is a very helpful practice to ensure that it's truly embedded and it's lived by the teams, by the individuals. So this is the way that I practically recommend that you implement this. The lens that I wanted to bring today was really helping you to understand that the question, who should adapt, really has a number of assumptions that sit behind it. The more powerful question that you can be asking is, how do we work smarter together? Getting explicit about the differences that are naturally happening, recognizing them, acknowledging them, but then doing something with that, putting together strategies, plans, and implementing them so that you have explicit ways of what is professional behavior, what respect looks like, what is acceptable and effective, and how you're going to adapt. It might be that the answer is sometimes you adapt to one person. Sometimes you ask others to adapt. And sometimes it's not about adaptation at all to what's already within the group, the norms that have been established, but instead, everybody's adapting to a new way, a third way, a better way of doing things, which has become apparent when you've had this conversation. As we wrap up this episode, I really want you to reflect on a couple of questions here, because I think this is an important part of the learning on this podcast, which is that reflection. I always like to ask these questions at the end of the episode. So let me ask you, when you've been in a situation where you've had to move to a new context, whether that's a new country you've relocated to, a new organization that you joined, maybe it was about moving within the current organization, but to a very different department that had different style, a different way of doing things. Whatever your experience has been about, how did it feel to you to adapt? Did you feel like you had the choice to adapt? Or did you feel forced to conform to the norms that were already there? And as you think about how your team works today, I really want to encourage you to really consider this question. Have you ever discussed as a team explicitly how you work smarter together? I think this defining of your communication, your ways of working, your behaviors is incredibly important. It's a very vital part of success for teams that I see. And to do that, it starts with that drive, that knowledge of why it matters, the knowledge of the differences that are in the team, for example, through behavioral preferences, and then putting it into a strategy and action, making it happen. I recognize that some of you are probably nodding along to this episode and going, yep, I recognize this. I've been that person who's on the outside, been the minority, and felt forced to be something I'm not. Maybe you have been part of the majority and been working with people who you just feel like have been operating in a really different way, and it's been hard to find the way to work with them. Whatever your experience has been, I'm sure you've had this experience. So if it is something that's live right now, maybe you are having challenges as a team, as a group of leaders around adaptation, about a feeling of who should adapt within the team, about working smarter together, I would absolutely love to have a conversation and share with you more about the cultural intelligence approach and how it could work for your team. If that's something you'd love to talk to me about, then please feel free to set up a clarity call with me. And you can do that by either messaging me over on LinkedIn, or I'll put a link into the show notes as well. In the meantime, I've really enjoyed sharing this episode here today. It's been really reflective to talk about this topic and this question that I see coming up time and time again. If you have questions on this topic, if you've got experiences, again, just reach out and share those with me on LinkedIn. I'm always really curious about how this lands with you. In the meantime, thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for being here, and look forward to seeing you next time.